On this day in 1950, a convoy of North Korean tanks rolled across the border into South Korea and launched a surprise invasion. Over the next 3 years, the brutal conflict would result in the deaths of at least 1 million combatants and an estimated 2.5 million Korean civilians, before ending in a stalemate that left the two Koreas divided once more. So how did the first conflict of the Cold War begin? And how did nearly 40,000 U.S. servicemen come to lose their lives on a peninsula thousands of miles from home? Why was Korea divided in two? From 1910 until 1945, Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. Colonial rule was oppressive and assimilationist, and many Korean nationalists, including the parents of future North Korean dictator Kim Il-sung, sought refuge in China. Following the Japanese defeat in the Second World War, China, the UK and the US adopted a joint resolution that Korea should become an independent country. The problem was that the US only occupied the southern part of the peninsula, while the north had been liberated by Soviet troops. It was agreed to divide Korea in two, at a demarcation line known as the 38th parallel. Kim Il-sung, who had made a name for himself as a guerrilla leader in the fight to drive Japanese occupiers from the northern Chinese territory of Manchuria, was installed as head of a communist North Korean state under the aegis of Moscow. With Soviet support, Kim initiated a series of radical reforms to bring North Korea's economy and society in line with communist ideals. In the south, the U.S. occupiers struggled to appease a restless population divided into communist and nationalist factions and chafing at the prospect of more foreign rule. Finally, in a controversial 1948 election, U.S.-backed conservative Syngman Rhee became the first president of the Republic of Korea. How did war break out between North and South Korea? The 38th parallel was a clumsy, makeshift solution, hastily drawn with pencil using a National Geographic map by two junior American officers in President Truman's White House, according to a 2013 article by author Clancy Sigel for The Guardian. Conflict was all but inevitable. The core problem was that both North and South viewed the division of the peninsula as temporary, and both Kim and Rhee viewed themselves as the legitimate leader of a united Korea. Neither dictator was content to remain on his side of the 38th parallel, however, and border skirmishes were common, says the History Channel. Finally, with approval from Moscow, the invasion of the South was launched. The 75,000-strong North Korean army, well-trained and armed by their Soviet and Chinese communist allies, made short work of the poorly prepared South Korean defenders. 3 days after crossing the border, Pyongyang's forces entered Seoul. How did the U.S. become involved? The rapid advance of North Korean forces alarmed U.S. leaders, who viewed South Korea as a bulwark against the spread of Soviet communism in the Asia-Pacific, says Time. 2 days after the invasion began, President Truman announced that the U.S. was to commit its military forces to protect South Korea. The attack upon Korea makes it plain beyond all doubt that communism has passed beyond the use of subversion to conquer independent nations and will now use armed invasion and war, he said in a statement to Congress. With UN backing, a US-led coalition that included troops from the UK, Canada, Turkey and other member states was dispatched to bolster the South Korean defense. The brutality of the Korean War has largely been overlooked by U.S. history, says Newsweek, but the conflict has long shaped Washington's troubled political relationship, or lack thereof, with North Korea. The Korean War would also have cultural ramifications in the U.S. The Soviet-backed invasion, the first military action of the Cold War, helped set the tone for Soviet-American rivalry during the Cold War, says the New York Times, profoundly shaping the world we live in today. How did it end and what happened after? Following a bloody back-and-forth across the Korean peninsula, an armistice was finally signed in July 1953. The two sides stopped short of a peace accord, meaning they are technically still at war, almost 70 years after fighting ceased. The intervening years have seen a tense border standoff between North Korean troops and South Korean forces, backed by the U.S. Around 70% of North Korea's ground forces occupy an area within 60 miles of the so-called Demilitarized Zone (DMZ), the buffer zone that divides the two sides, making it one of the most heavily militarized and mined strips of land on Earth. Between 1953 and 1999, sporadic outbreaks of violence have killed over 500 South Korean soldiers, 50 U.S. soldiers and 250 soldiers from North Korea. But there could be light at the end of the tunnel. Under the Panmunjom Declaration signed by North Korean leader Kim Jong-un and his South Korean counterpart Moon Jae-in earlier this year, the Koreas pledged to work towards a formal end to the Korean War, 65 years after hostilities ceased. Two sticking points could be China and the U.S., under the banner of the United Nations, who are major combatants in the Korean War, and whose involvement will be required for any official end to the conflict, says CNN. China has indicated its support for a formal peace agreement, while a commitment by North Korea to return the remains of U.S. servicemen killed in the conflict could go a long way to securing American support for a permanent peace deal.